The evening I almost sold my sister's greenhouse, a stranger handed me a small clay flower pot and said, "I think this belongs to you." At the time, I thought he was simply mistaken. Looking back now, at 69 years old, I understand that he wasn't returning a flower pot at all. He was quietly returning a part of my life I believed had disappeared forever. My name is Evelyn Carter, and this happened in Portland, Oregon. For nearly 40 years, my older sister Margaret and I owned a neighborhood flower shop tucked between a bakery and an old bookstore. We never became wealthy. We never wanted to. We simply grew flowers, arranged bouquets, remembered birthdays, and watched children become parents, and parents become grandparents. Some customers came for roses. Others came because they needed someone to ask how they were doing. Margaret had a way of making every person feel expected. I was better with the flowers than with people. She used to laugh and say I could hear what a plant needed long before I could hear what another person was trying to tell me. She wasn't wrong. When Margaret died after a short illness, I tried to keep the shop open. For 6 months, I unlocked the front door every morning. I watered the hanging baskets. I swept the sidewalk. I filled buckets with fresh flowers. But something had changed. The laughter that once echoed through the little building had been replaced by a silence that seemed to settle into the wooden floorboards. Customers noticed it before I did. They spoke more softly. They stayed for shorter visits. Eventually, I realized they weren't avoiding the shop. They were trying to avoid my grief. One rainy Tuesday, I locked the front door for the last time. I didn't cry. Sometimes sadness grows so familiar that it no longer arrives as tears. It simply becomes another piece of furniture inside your life. I donated most of the remaining plants to community gardens. The building was sold a few months later. People told me retirement would be relaxing. I smiled because it seemed easier than explaining that rest is difficult when you've spent your entire adult life caring for something that no longer exists. My mornings became quiet, too quiet. I drank coffee on the porch, read the newspaper from beginning to end, watered 3 small pots of lavender that somehow managed to survive my lack of enthusiasm. Neighbors waved. I waved back. Some days that was the longest conversation I had. My niece called every Sunday. She worried about me more than she admitted. She invited me to move closer to her family. I always thanked her. I always said maybe next year. The truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to leave the neighborhood where nearly every corner carried a memory. At my age, memories become landmarks. You learn to navigate by them. One afternoon, I noticed a flyer taped to the bulletin board outside the public library. Volunteers needed. Rosewood Botanical Conservatory. Evening garden assistance. No experience necessary. I almost laughed. 40 years surrounded by flowers, and someone was telling me experience wasn't necessary. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I folded the flyer and slipped it into my coat pocket. 3 days later, I walked through the conservatory's front gate. It was much larger than I expected. Glass roofs stretched high overhead, collecting the last light of the afternoon. Paths curved through ferns, orchids, and flowering vines from places I had only read about. Children were leaving with their parents. Older couples wandered slowly, pointing at blossoms whose names they couldn't remember. The building felt peaceful in a way my house no longer did. The volunteer coordinator greeted me warmly. She explained that most evening volunteers helped water delicate plants, trim damaged leaves, organize tools, and prepare displays before the conservatory opened the following morning. Nothing complicated, nothing hurried. Exactly the kind of work my hands still remembered how to do. During my first week, I spoke very little. That wasn't unusual. Grief teaches you how to disappear politely. You answer questions. You smile when appropriate. You leave before anyone feels obligated to ask if you're all right. The conservatory closed to visitors at 6 each evening. After that, the building became wonderfully quiet, not lonely, just calm. The sounds changed. Instead of footsteps and conversations, there was running water, the soft scrape of gardening tools, and birds settling into hidden branches beneath the enormous glass ceiling. I found comfort in those sounds. Plants never ask you to explain yourself. They simply respond to patience. Near the end of my second week, I noticed an older man repairing one of the wooden benches near the fern house. He worked slowly, not because he lacked strength, because he seemed to believe every task deserved its full attention. He sanded rough edges before replacing worn boards. He tightened loose screws that no visitor would ever notice. When he finished, he brushed away every trace of sawdust with the care of someone preparing a dining room table for guests. Someone eventually introduced us. His name was Thomas. He had been maintaining the conservatory grounds for nearly 20 years. He nodded politely when we met. "Beautiful evening," he said. "It usually is in here," I answered. That was the entire conversation. Oddly enough, it felt complete. Over the next several weeks, our paths crossed almost every evening. Sometimes we exchanged a few words. Sometimes we didn't speak at all. He always arrived carrying an old metal lunch pail that had clearly seen decades of use. I always carried a canvas gardening bag with gloves that still smelled faintly of soil and roses. We never arranged to work together. The conservatory simply had a rhythm, and somehow our routines settled into it. If I finished watering the orchids, he was usually repairing a handrail nearby. If I organized seed trays, he was often pruning shrubs outside the western greenhouse. There was nothing remarkable about it. At least, that's what I believed then. Life has a curious way of hiding its most important beginnings inside moments that seem entirely ordinary. If someone had asked me during those first weeks whether anything meaningful was changing, I would have shaken my head. I was simply volunteering, simply keeping busy, simply filling quiet evenings that once belonged to someone else. And yet, without realizing it, I had already begun looking forward to walking through those conservatory gates each afternoon, not because I expected anything exciting to happen, but because, for the first time since my sister was gone, there was somewhere that no longer reminded me only of what I had lost. There was, instead, a place where I could quietly begin learning who I might still become. It didn't happen all at once. Looking back, I don't think meaningful friendships ever do. They arrive so quietly that you don't notice them until they've already become part of your life. By the middle of spring, the conservatory had settled into its familiar rhythm, and so had I. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I tied on the same faded gardening apron, greeted whoever happened to be working that evening, and lost myself among the plants until closing time. There was comfort in repetition. After enough years of uncertainty, ordinary routines begin to feel like a gift. Thomas was almost always somewhere nearby. Sometimes he repaired irrigation lines. Sometimes he rebuilt wooden planters that had weathered too many winters. Other evenings he simply walked the winding paths with a small notebook, stopping every few minutes to write something before moving on again. I finally asked him one evening what he was always writing. He smiled without looking up. "Things people don't notice." I laughed. "That sounds mysterious." "It isn't," he said. "A loose hinge today becomes a broken gate next month. A cracked branch today becomes a fallen tree after the first heavy storm." He tucked the notebook back into his jacket. "I've learned that most problems introduce themselves politely." That sentence stayed with me much longer than I expected, perhaps because grief behaves the same way. It rarely arrives all at once. It settles quietly into ordinary days until one morning you realize you've been carrying it for years. As the weeks passed, I began noticing the conservatory, the way Thomas did. A vine leaning farther than it had the week before, a sprinkler head that no longer reached the far corner of a flower bed, a child who visited every Saturday just to see the butterflies, an elderly couple who always sat on the same bench for exactly 20 minutes before walking home hand in hand. The world had not changed, only my attention had. One rainy evening, the volunteer coordinator apologized because the weather had kept visitors away. The building echoed more than usual. Water tapped softly against the enormous glass roof while mist gathered between the tropical gardens and the orchid house. Most volunteers left early. I stayed behind to finish repotting a tray of young ferns. Thomas worked outside beneath the covered entrance, replacing several loose boards along the walkway before the weekend crowds arrived. When I finished, I carried the empty pots toward the storage shed. As I passed the entrance, I noticed him kneeling beside one of the stone paths. He wasn't repairing anything. He was carefully moving a line of tiny snails away from the edge before the evening maintenance cart rolled through. I stood there longer than I probably should have. When he finally looked up, he shrugged. They've had the path longer than we have. It wasn't the sort of comment that makes newspapers. No one applauds someone for saving snails, but something about that small act stayed with me. Margaret used to stop the car for turtles crossing country roads. I'd forgotten that until that moment. Funny how memories wait for permission before returning. After that evening, conversation came a little easier. Not every day. Neither of us was particularly talkative. Some nights we worked side by side for half an hour without speaking. Oddly enough, silence never felt uncomfortable. At our age, you stop believing every quiet moment needs to be filled with words. One Thursday, I brought 2 homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. I baked too many, I said. He accepted one with an amused smile. I've heard that excuse before. It happens to be true. So does mine whenever I bring extra coffee. We both laughed. It wasn't a remarkable exchange. Most people would have forgotten it before bedtime. I still remember it years later. Not because of the cookies, because it was the first time I realized I had laughed without feeling guilty afterward. For months, every happy moment had carried an invisible question. How could I smile when Margaret no longer could? Grief has a strange way of convincing us that healing is somehow disloyal. That evening, as I drove home, I realized I hadn't thought about that question once. Instead, I found myself wondering whether the lilies near the east greenhouse would bloom before Memorial Day. That surprised me. It was the first time in a very long while that tomorrow seemed more interesting than yesterday. The conservatory changed with the seasons. Tulips faded, hydrangeas opened, summer visitors began arriving in larger numbers. Families wandered slowly through the gardens while volunteers answered questions about flowers they had never heard of before. I discovered that I enjoyed those conversations more than I expected. People weren't asking for expertise. Most of the time, they simply wanted someone to share their curiosity. Thomas noticed everything, not in an intrusive way. Simply the way certain people observe the world because they've spent a lifetime paying attention. If a child looked overwhelmed, he'd quietly lower himself onto one knee before explaining something instead of towering over them. If an elderly visitor hesitated near uneven pavement, he'd appear nearby without making them feel embarrassed. If a volunteer looked tired, an extra bottle of water somehow found its way onto the nearest workbench. None of it seemed planned. It was simply who he was. One evening I asked how he always knew when someone needed help. He considered the question for a long moment. I don't always know, he admitted. I just try not to assume people are fine because they're smiling. I didn't answer immediately. Neither did he. The sound of sprinklers filled the space between us. As I watched water settle gently across rows of climbing roses, I realized how many years I had spent trying to appear perfectly fine. Neighbors believed I was adjusting. My niece believed I was staying busy. Even I had started believing it. Perhaps because saying, "I'm managing," was easier than saying, "Some days I still don't know who I am without the person I spent most of my life beside." The strange thing was that Thomas never asked those questions. He never tried to fix loneliness. He simply behaved as though my presence mattered. Sometimes that's more healing than advice. By early June, volunteering no longer felt like something I did to pass the time. It had quietly become part of the life I was building instead of the life I was remembering. And although I couldn't have explained exactly why, I found myself paying closer attention not only to the flowers that changed with each passing week, but to the small, almost invisible moments that most people walked past without ever seeing. Summer arrived quietly that year. You could tell by the smell before you noticed it with your eyes. The air inside the conservatory grew warmer. The roses opened faster. The jasmine climbed a little farther each week, filling entire walkways with a fragrance that lingered long after visitors had gone home. I found myself arriving earlier than my volunteer shift required, not because anyone expected me to, simply because I liked being there before the doors opened. There is something peaceful about a place before people arrive. The benches wait patiently. The birds seem less hurried. Even the sunlight enters more gently. Most mornings of my life had once belonged to schedules, deliveries, invoices, and customers. These evenings belonged to no one. I was beginning to appreciate that. Thomas was already there nearly every time I arrived. Sometimes he was replacing weathered fence boards. Other evenings he inspected irrigation valves or trimmed shrubs that had grown a little too comfortably into the walking paths. He always acknowledged me with the same quiet smile. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced. Just enough to let me know I had been noticed. I didn't realize how much that mattered until much later. One Tuesday afternoon, the volunteer coordinator asked if I would help prepare a small display celebrating heirloom flowers. She explained that many visitors had never seen varieties their grandparents once grew. As I arranged faded photographs beside fresh blossoms, I caught myself smiling. Every flower carried a story. Some had crossed oceans tucked inside family luggage. Others survived because one person bothered to save a handful of seeds each season. Strange, isn't it? Sometimes entire histories survive because somebody refuses to overlook something small. That evening, a little girl wandered away from her parents and stopped in front of the display. She couldn't have been older than 7. She pointed toward an old photograph. "My grandma had those." I looked closer. Pink climbing roses. "My sister loved those too," I said. The little girl nodded as though that explained everything. Then she ran off before I could say another word. For several minutes I stood there looking at flowers that no longer existed in my own garden. I expected sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude, not because I missed Margaret any less, because remembering her no longer hurt quite the same way. The difference surprised me. Healing is rarely something you notice while it's happening. Usually you recognize it only after you've already crossed some invisible line. As the weeks passed, more volunteers joined the evening shifts. College students home for the summer. Retired couples looking for something meaningful to do together. Parents whose children had finally grown up. Everyone arrived carrying a different story. Everyone left a little calmer than when they had arrived. Plants have that effect on people, perhaps because they ask for patience instead of certainty. One Friday evening, a strong thunderstorm rolled through just before closing. Visitors hurried toward the exits, while volunteers secured lightweight displays before the wind reached them. The rain came suddenly, heavy enough that conversation disappeared beneath the sound of water striking the glass roof. For nearly an hour we worked quietly, moving benches, covering delicate seedlings, checking drainage channels. Nothing unusual, simply taking care of a place that had quietly begun taking care of us. When everything was finally secure, most volunteers hurried home. Thomas remained behind to inspect the oldest greenhouse. I stayed too, not because anyone asked, because leaving before the work was finished no longer felt natural. The older greenhouse stood near the back of the conservatory, where fewer visitors wandered. Its wooden beams had been standing for decades. Beautiful, reliable, just old enough to require attention. Thomas examined one of the support posts with unusual concentration. He rested one hand against the wood for several seconds without saying anything. Then he reached into his pocket and made another note in that little notebook he always carried. "You found something?" I asked. He nodded. "Not today." I looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "This beam has been weakening for months." I ran my fingers across the painted surface. It looked perfectly normal. "I don't see anything." "Most people wouldn't." He tapped lightly near the bottom. The sound was strangely hollow. "Water found a way inside years ago." I frowned. "But it still looks solid." "It does." He smiled gently. "So do a lot of people." Neither of us spoke after that. He called the maintenance supervisor, who inspected the beam and immediately closed that section of the greenhouse until repairs could be made. No one panicked. No emergency. No dramatic collapse. Just one careful observation made early enough to prevent something worse. As we walked toward the staff entrance later that evening, I kept thinking about that wooden beam, outwardly beautiful, quietly weakening from the inside. How many people spent years doing exactly that? I certainly had. I had answered every question with, "I'm doing fine." I had smiled through conversations, attended family dinners, sent birthday cards, remembered anniversaries, paid bills, watered plants. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, even to me, perhaps especially to me. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, grief had been slowly hollowing out parts of my life I hadn't realized needed repair. Not destroying them, simply wearing them thinner than anyone could see. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was upset, because I couldn't stop thinking about all the invisible things people carry. The next afternoon I arrived with 2 sandwiches instead of 1. Thomas looked at the extra package sitting beside my gardening gloves. "I wasn't sure whether you'd eaten." He looked at the sandwiches, then at me. "You've been paying attention." "I suppose I have." We ate outside beneath a large maple tree overlooking the pond. Conversation drifted wherever it pleased. Favorite seasons, old family recipes, books neither of us had finished reading. The way birds somehow knew exactly when evening was approaching. Simple things, ordinary things, the sort of conversations that quietly remind you that companionship isn't built through grand moments. It's built through enough small ones. As the sun lowered behind the conservatory glass, visitors gradually disappeared until only volunteers remained. Someone laughed from across the courtyard. A garden hose hissed softly nearby. Wind moved through the tall grasses beyond the walking paths. I looked around and realized something that caught me completely off guard. Months earlier, I had come to this place hoping only to fill empty evenings. Without noticing, I had begun belonging here, not because I had earned it, not because anyone had invited me, simply because people had continued making room for me until, one quiet day, it no longer felt like I was standing on the outside looking in. I didn't know then that one ordinary afternoon was about to change the way I understood all of those quiet moments. At the time, they still felt like nothing more than small acts of kindness scattered through ordinary days. The turning point came so quietly that I almost missed it. There was no dramatic announcement, no life-changing phone call, no terrible news waiting at my front door. Just an ordinary Wednesday that began like dozens before it. The conservatory was hosting a small evening event for local families. Children wandered through the butterfly house with wide eyes, while volunteers answered questions and pointed out flowers that bloomed only after sunset. I spent most of the evening helping an elderly couple find a particular variety of white camellia. Thomas was repairing a weathered railing near the pond. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Near closing time, I noticed one of our newest volunteers standing alone beside the propagation room. Her name was Claire. She had joined only a few weeks earlier. After retiring from 35 years of teaching elementary school, she was always cheerful, always eager to help. But that evening she looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, the way people sometimes do when they're carrying something too heavy to describe. I walked over and asked if she needed help putting away the watering cans. She smiled automatically. "I'm fine." For just a second, I almost accepted the answer. After all, I had given that same answer hundreds of times myself. Then I remembered Thomas, the notebook, the loose hinges, the hollow beam, the tiny things people rarely noticed until they became impossible to ignore. Instead of walking away, I simply stayed beside her. Neither of us spoke for a minute or two. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was patient. Finally, she sighed. "My husband would have loved this place." I looked at her. "He passed away last winter." Those words carried no tears, only exhaustion. "I keep telling everyone I'm adjusting," she continued quietly. "I think I've gotten so good at saying it that people believe me." I understood exactly what she meant. For years I had mistaken surviving for healing. I had become so practiced at appearing all right that even I had forgotten to ask whether I truly was. We sat together on one of the wooden benches until the last visitors left. She talked a little. Sometimes she stopped halfway through a sentence. Sometimes she simply watched the koi move beneath the surface of the pond. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed solving. When we finally stood to leave, she smiled. A real smile this time. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For staying." She walked toward the parking lot, and I remained where I was for another minute. The evening air smelled faintly of jasmine. Across the courtyard, Thomas finished locking one of the garden gates. As he walked toward me, I realized something that had been quietly changing for months. He had never tried to rescue me. He had never tried to replace my sister. He had never offered advice about grief or told me life would get easier. He had simply noticed me, again and again, the same way he noticed cracked boards before they broke, or thirsty plants before they wilted, or visitors who needed a place to sit. His kindness had never been loud enough to demand gratitude. It had simply been consistent enough to change someone. I don't think transformation usually arrives because of one extraordinary moment. I think it arrives after hundreds of ordinary ones finally become impossible to separate from the person you've become. That realization stayed with me long after I drove home. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slowing down. Not because age required it, because attention did. I remembered birthdays without writing them down. I learned the names of every volunteer instead of simply recognizing their faces. When someone lingered after everyone else had gone home, I no longer assumed they preferred being alone. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they simply needed another few minutes before returning to an empty house. The conservatory gradually became more than a place filled with flowers. It became a place where people quietly carried one another through seasons they rarely spoke about. Autumn arrived before I noticed summer had ended. The maples outside the glass walls turned shades of copper and gold. Visitors admired the colors. Volunteers prepared beds for winter. Life continued exactly as it always had, only I hadn't. One afternoon, the volunteer coordinator asked whether I would consider welcoming new volunteers during their first week. Apparently, several people felt more comfortable after meeting someone who understood what it was like to begin again later in life. I accepted before giving myself time to overthink it. The role wasn't complicated. I simply showed people where the tools were kept, explained how the watering schedule worked, introduced them to familiar faces. Most importantly, I tried to notice the person standing in front of me before noticing the work they had come to do. Months earlier, someone had quietly done exactly that for me. I never considered it a favor. I considered it a gift. And gifts, I've learned, have a gentle way of asking to be passed along. By the time winter settled over the conservatory once again, the evenings no longer felt like something I needed to fill. They had become part of a life that felt whole in a different way than before. Not because the past hurt less, but because the present had finally made room to grow beside it. When people ask me these days whether I miss my sister, I always smile before I answer. Of course I do. There isn't a season that passes without something reminding me of Margaret. The first tulips in early spring, the scent of fresh lavender after rain. The way roses seem to bloom all at once when the weather finally turns warm. For a long time, those reminders felt like tiny losses repeated over and over again. Now they feel more like quiet conversations that never truly ended. I think that's one of the surprising things about growing older. The people we love don't disappear from our lives. Our relationship with their memory simply changes. Some evenings, after the conservatory closes, I like to walk one slow circle through the gardens before I go home. Not because there's work left to do. Mostly because I enjoy seeing the place settle into silence. The birds grow quiet. The last rays of sunlight drift across the glass roof. The flowers simply continue being themselves, whether anyone is watching or not. There is something comforting about that. Life keeps unfolding in ordinary ways. It doesn't ask whether we're ready. It simply invites us to notice. Thomas still carries the same old lunch pail. He still keeps that little notebook in his jacket pocket. I don't know if he'll ever stop writing things down. I hope he doesn't. Every now and then, he'll point toward a branch that's beginning to split, or a flower bed that needs a little more water. Sometimes I notice those things before he does now. He usually smiles when I mention them. "You're paying attention," he'll say. I suppose I am. Not only to the gardens, to people, to quiet moments, to the gentle changes that happen so slowly they're almost invisible. Several months ago, Claire became one of the volunteers who now welcomes newcomers. The first evening I watched her showing an older gentleman where the greenhouse tools were stored. I couldn't help smiling. She wasn't giving instructions. She was giving him the same feeling someone had once given us. The feeling that he already belonged before he had done anything to earn it. That simple thought stayed with me all the way home. Belonging isn't something we're handed all at once. Sometimes it's built through 100 ordinary moments that seem too small to matter. A shared cup of coffee, a familiar greeting, someone remembering your name, someone noticing when you've become unusually quiet. None of those moments change a life by themselves. Together they often do. I've lived long enough to know that we rarely recognize life's turning points while we're standing inside them. We see them clearly only after enough time has passed for the pieces to fit together. Looking back now, I don't believe volunteering at the conservatory saved me. The flowers didn't erase my grief. The seasons didn't remove my loneliness. Time alone didn't heal either one. What changed me was far simpler. Someone made room for me before I believed I deserved a place. And without realizing it, I eventually began making room for others. That quiet exchange became the beginning of a different kind of life, not a perfect one, just a fuller one. If there's one thought I carry with me now, it's this. We spend so much of life believing that the extraordinary moments define us. But more often than not, it's the ordinary ones that quietly shape who we become. The conversations that last only a few minutes. The familiar faces we come to expect without realizing it. The simple kindness that asks for nothing in return. Those are the moments that stay. Those are the moments that gently change us. Before I leave you, I'd like to ask one small favor. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories find others who may need them too. And if you'd like, tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story spoke to your heart. I always enjoy reading your thoughts. Thank you for spending a little of your time with me. Take good care of yourself. And the next time someone quietly crosses your path, don't be too quick to believe they're just another ordinary face. Sometimes the smallest connections become the ones that stay with us the longest.